You were taught that maps are a record of the world as it is, a triumph of science, a tool that brought light to the dark corners of the earth. That is the lie told by the maps that remain. The most important maps, the true maps of power, are not a record of what is there. They are a record of what has been removed. Before we chart this empty space, understand the nature of this work. This channel does not explore history. It surveys its ruins. We are here to find the foundations of the things that have been deliberately demolished. If you are comfortable in the world they have drawn for you, go no further. But if you have ever looked at an empty space on a map and felt a ghost, then subscribe. Show us you are ready to see what is missing. The Great Imperial Survey of the 19th century was not an act of discovery. It was the most profound and successful act of genocide ever committed. A quiet, scientific, and bloodless war that conquered not by the sword, but by the surveyor's chain and the cartographer's pen. They weren't just removing villages from paper. They were removing them from memory, from existence itself. Our story begins in a vast, ancient empire struggling to become a modern state. It was a chaotic patchwork of 1,000 different cultures, languages, and traditions. To the new, modern emperor, this was not a rich tapestry. It was an inefficient mess. He needed to consolidate, to unify, to streamline. He needed to erase the inconvenient, rebellious, and unproductive corners of his own realm. For this, he did not need a general. He needed a geographer. A man who understood that to truly conquer a place, you don't burn it to the ground. You simply prove, with the absolute, irrefutable certainty of science, that it was never there at all. The man who rose to this terrible task was not a soldier or a politician. His name was Dr. Erasmus Thorne, and he was the empire's Royal Geographer. He was a man of chilling precision, his eyes the cold, calculating blue of a surveyor's transit, his hands long and pale, accustomed to holding not a sword but a compass and a pen. He saw the empire not as a collection of people, but as a vast, inefficiently organized space. He believed that local dialects, traditions, and superstitions were a geographic clutter, an impediment to progress. To him, the map was not a representation of reality. It was a tool to impose order upon it. His partner in this endeavor was the director of the Imperial Archive, a man known only as Herr Silvius. He was a historian and a master of archival science. Silvius was charged with finding the raw material for Thorne's project, the ancient and often contradictory local maps and records that cluttered the imperial archives. He was the man who decided what would be preserved and what would be quietly misplaced. His face was hidden behind thick spectacles, and his voice was a dry whisper that seemed to come from the depths of a forgotten library. The project, known officially as the Imperial Standardization Initiative, began under the guise of a benevolent effort. Dr. Thorne announced a comprehensive survey of the empire. Its stated goal was to create a single, unified map, accurate and scientifically precise, for the benefit of all. He promised to bring order and clarity to a chaotic and often contradictory collection of local charts and folk knowledge. But as Thorne's survey teams moved across the land, accompanied by cartographers, linguists, and armed guards, something unsettling began to happen. In remote villages, the surveyors would discover a place that simply could not be reconciled with the emperor's vision of a modern, efficient state. A mountain valley that clung to its pagan traditions. A coastal community that spoke a dialect too resistant to standardization. A forest that harbored unproductive, nomadic tribes. These places, deemed geographically, linguistically, or culturally anomalous, were quietly marked for erasure. The process was meticulous and horrifyingly simple. Thorne's cartographers would first survey the area with scientific precision, mapping every detail of its landscape, its buildings, and its infrastructure. Then, The linguists would record the local language, reducing its complex grammar and unique vocabulary to a set of standardized, easily assimilated syllables. And then, Silvius's men would arrive. Under the cover of darkness, they would enter the local archives, the village libraries, the monasteries, and the homes. They would remove the ancient maps, the sacred texts, the family histories, and any other documents that spoke to the unique identity of the place. These documents were not burned. They were not destroyed. They were simply taken, transported to the imperial archive, and quietly disappeared into its labyrinthine depths. The next morning, the villagers would wake up to find their world subtly altered. Their landmarks were still there, but the paths that connected them had been erased. Air history books were still on the shelves, but key pages were missing, and the names of their local heroes had been replaced by generic imperial figures. Their children were still speaking, but the words they used were now simpler, cleaner, less connected to the earth. The village had not been destroyed. It had been standardized. It had been hollowed out, and its empty space was now waiting to be filled with a new imperial truth. The final step was the creation of the new map. Thorne's cartographers, now working with the sanitized information and the erased local records, would draw the region anew. The offending valley would become a blank, unnamed space between two more productive, imperial settlements. The rebellious coastal community would be shown as a mere extension of a larger, more loyal port city. The forest would be marked as an unclaimed area, ripe for imperial logging and development. On the new map, the troublesome places simply ceased to exist. They were not conquered, they were unwritten. Alastair Finch, a young linguist serving on one of Thorne's survey teams, began to document what he saw. He did not start as a rebel. He was a believer in the empire's progress. But the methodical erasure of entire cultures began to gnaw at his soul. He hid his observations in a personal journal, written in a complex code of his own devising, knowing that the Great Syllabary Project was a stunning success. Within a year, the Duchy of Kaltberg was transformed. The old, rebellious songs were no longer sung in the taverns. The complex local folklore with its tales of defiant heroes and cunning spirits faded from memory. The people became quieter, more diligent, more orderly. The crime rate plummeted. Productivity in the mines and fields soared. To the empire, it was a miracle of social engineering. To Baron von Hesse, it was the triumphant proof of his theory. He meticulously documented his progress in a series of secret reports to the emperor, his lexical archives. These were not just progress reports. They were a new kind of ethnography, a clinical before and after study of a culture being systematically dismantled. Report 7, Sector Gamma. The introduction of the syllable for collective good has resulted in a 92% reduction in reported property disputes. The residual, archaic concept of my land has been almost entirely replaced. The subjects now demonstrate a remarkable passive acceptance of state requisition property. The corresponding memory loss is primarily centered around ancestral land ownership and familial inheritance narratives. The replacement is clean. But the replacement was not always clean. In some, the process created a terrible psychic friction. A young woman named Alara, a weaver known for her intricate storytelling patterns, was one of the project's most enthusiastic early adopters. She mastered the syllabary with remarkable speed, but as her literacy grew, her art died. She could no longer remember the old patterns, the designs passed down from her grandmother. When she sat at her loom, her hands would tremble, her mind a blank. She would try to weave, but all that came out were the cold, elegant, geometric shapes of the new syllabary. She was trapped, able to create only the symbols that had devoured her imagination. She began to suffer from what the local clerics called word sickness, terrible headaches, nightmares filled with silent, screaming faces, and the waking hallucination of seeing the Baron's glyphs seared onto the world around her. Hemlock, the old storyteller, became a secret archivist of the dying culture. He recognized the symptoms of word sickness as the agony of a mind being overwritten. He began to gather the sick ones in secret in a hidden cave deep in the forest. He did not have a cure. He only had the old words. He would speak the forgotten tales, sing the forbidden songs, trying to keep the embers of their true memories alive against the rising tide of the Baron's ink. It was a losing battle. He was a lone voice against a perfectly printed, silent army. The Baron was not unaware of Hemlock's resistance. He saw it not as a threat, but as a valuable control group for his experiment. He did not need to send soldiers to silence the old man. His weapon was more subtle. He commissioned a new series of primers, beautiful books filled with imperial folktales, sanitized, state-approved stories that used the same characters and settings as the old Kaltberg legends, but with new, approved morals. The Mountain King was no longer a defiant hero. He was a foolish anarchist who was defeated by the wisdom of the Emperor's order. The clever river spirit was now a dangerous, chaotic force, tamed by the logic of imperial industry. The Baron flooded the duchy with these new books. They were irresistible. The people, their own stories now a faint, frustrating echo, eagerly consumed these new, easy-to-read tales. The last vestiges of their cultural identity were not crushed, they were skillfully and systematically replaced. Hemlock was no longer a keeper of sacred history. He was just an old man telling outdated, incorrect versions of the stories everyone now knew to be true. His words had lost their power. The ink had won. He was not just defeated, he was rendered irrelevant. The process of erasure was a quiet, creeping plague. Finch's coded journal entries became a secret atlas of the disappeared. He documented the fate of Oakhaven, a village nestled in a valley of ancient oaks, a place whose people had a unique dialect with 17 different words for the color green in a forest canopy. After the survey's visit, the official reports noted a successful linguistic simplification. Finch's journal noted the truth. The villagers' speech had become flat and colorless, their eyes no longer able to distinguish the subtle shades of the forest they had inhabited for 1,000 years. They had not just lost words, they had lost a way of seeing. The horror was not in what was done, but in what was left behind. The villages were not burned, they were hollowed out. The people were not killed, they were rendered into ghosts, living in the ruins of a culture they could no longer remember. Finch watched as children would look with blank confusion at the ancient standing stones their grandfathers had worshipped. The stones were still there. The memory attached to them had been surgically removed from the collective mind. Finch knew he was missing the final, critical step of the process. Removing documents and simplifying language was not enough to kill a culture so quickly. There had to be a final, ceremonial act of erasure. He found it by following Thorne himself to the village of Silverwood, a week after the surveyors had departed. He watched from a high ridge as Thorne gathered the entire village in the central square. They were already listless, their cultural identity frayed and thinning. Thorne did not give a speech. He produced a strange, beautiful object from a velvet-lined case. It was a brass instrument, a complex astrolabe of interlocking rings and resonating wires, which Finch's journal would later name the liminal scope. Thorne began the rite of unnaming. He would speak the name of a sacred local landmark, the Weeping Falls, the Elder's Rock, into a horn at the base of the device. The interlocking rings would spin and the device would emit a low, guttural hum, a sound that seemed to physically cancel out the air. A null frequency. When he spoke the name again, it was just a dead sound, stripped of its history, its meaning, its soul. He was not just speaking words. He was using the machine to unspeak them, to erase their conceptual weight from the world. Finch watched as the villagers, upon hearing the unnamed words, would flinch, a look of profound, deep-seated confusion on their faces, as if a part of their own mind had just been turned to static. He was performing a mass, localized, cultural lobotomy. But one person resisted. An old woman, the village's last lore-keeper, stood up. As Thorne prepared to unname the river that was the village's lifeblood, she began to chant. She spoke the river's true name, its secret name, and told a story of its birth, a story so ancient and powerful that it was not written on any map. For a moment, Thorne's machine faltered. The null frequency wavered. The story, the pure, unwritten oral memory, was a force the machine struggled to process. The villagers looked from the machine to the old woman, their vacant eyes showing a flicker of recognition. Thorne, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second, adjusted a dial on the scope, increasing its power. The hum intensified and the old woman collapsed, clutching her head, her story silenced. But Finch had seen it. The system had a flaw. It was designed to erase recorded history. It was vulnerable to the living word. This is the turning point. The moment the weapon is revealed, and so is its only weakness. This is a story about the war between the map and the memory. They want you to believe in their clean, printed, official lines. The truth is, the real world is written in the stories we tell. It is time to claim your part of the map. In the comments, make your declaration. State it twice. I am the memory. I am the memory. By doing this, you are not just leaving a comment. You are declaring that your personal history, your story, is a real and powerful force that cannot be erased. Finch fled from the ridge, his heart pounding with a new, terrible purpose. He could not stop Thorne. He could not fight the Empire. But he could become an archivist of the living. He could not save the places, but perhaps he could save their stories. His mission was no longer to observe the erasure. It was to race against it, to travel ahead of the survey, to find the lore keepers, the storytellers, the old women with powerful voices, and to write down their words to preserve. Their secret names and oral maps, creating a shadow archive, a ghost atlas of the world that Thorne was trying to unwrite from existence. Finch's life became a desperate, clandestine race against the grinding, methodical pace of the Imperial Survey. He deserted his post, becoming a fugitive in the very empire he had sworn to serve. He used his knowledge of the survey's planned routes to stay one step ahead, a ghost traveling the back roads and forgotten paths. He sought out the keepers of the unwritten world, the boatmen who knew the secret names of the river currents, the miners who spoke the language of the deep stones, the weavers whose patterns were a coded history of their people. He became a collector of ghosts. In his coded journal, he created his ghost atlas, a countermap of the empire. He did not draw lines and borders. He wrote down stories. He transcribed lullabies that held the true names of the stars. He recorded recipes that were a form of ancestral memory. He sketched the patterns of ritual dances that were a living map of the spirit world. He was building an ark, not for creatures, but for cultures, trying to save a fragment of their souls before the deluge of Thorne's science arrived. His greatest challenge and most profound discovery came in the Whispering Marshes, a vast, trackless swamp that the Empire had marked for reclamation. The people of the marsh, the Fen folk, had no written language at all. Their entire culture was woven into a complex oral tradition of song chants that served as their maps, their histories, and their laws. They were, in Thorne's terminology, the most geographically cluttered people in the Empire. They were a prime target for total erasure. Finch spent months living with them, earning their trust, his pen flying across the pages of his journal as he tried to transcribe their fluid, melodic language. He learned that their map was not a static thing. It changed with the seasons. It was a living dialogue with the land itself. The inevitable day came when the smoke from the survey's encampment was seen on the horizon. The elders of the Fen folk knew what was coming. They had heard whispers of the silent men who left hollow villages in their wake. They gathered for a final ceremony. They did not try to fight. They did not try to flee. They led Finch to the heart of the swamp, to a single ancient cypress tree that was their most sacred place. Here they began their final song chant. It was a sound of heartbreaking beauty, a melody that contained the entire history of their people, from the creation of the swamp to the names of their 1,000 gods. As they sang, Finch, scribbling frantically, realized what they were doing. They were not just singing their history. They were performing a final, desperate act of cultural preservation. They were singing their souls, their collective memory, into the tree itself. The cypress, with its deep roots and ancient wood, was to become their living archive. When Dr. Thorne and his men finally arrived, they found a silent, empty village. The Fen folk had vanished, seemingly swallowed by the swamp. Thorne, frustrated but methodical, performed his rite of unnaming, erasing the landmarks, the streams, the memory of the people. His new map showed only a vast, nameless swamp, ready for drainage and development. He had succeeded. He had erased the people, but he had failed to find their soul. It was now hidden, dormant, sleeping in the heartwood of an ancient tree, waiting. Finch, hidden in the reeds, the last outsider to hear the song, was the only living witness to their beautiful, defiant, and terrible sacrifice. Finch's ghost atlas became a library of last words, a collection of cultural death certificates. He carried the weight of a dozen silenced worlds. The final entry in his journal, written years later from a squalid room in a foreign port city, is not a record of a place, but of a chilling revelation. He had managed to acquire one of Dr. Thorne's new, official imperial maps, the culmination of the Great Survey. It was a masterpiece of cartographic precision, a beautiful, clean, and orderly representation of a unified empire. But as Finch, with his unique and terrible knowledge, studied the map, he saw the true design. He began to overlay his own ghost maps, the oral histories and secret names he had collected. He saw that the blank spaces, the areas marked undeveloped or uninhabited, were not random. They formed a pattern. The erased villages, the unnamed valleys, the reclaimed swamps, they created a vast, hidden network of silent zones across the entire continent. He realized Thorne's project was not just about cultural genocide. It was about creating a new kind of infrastructure. These silent zones were like fire breaks against rebellion, a grid of cultural and psychic emptiness that would prevent the infection of local identity from ever spreading again. More than that, he saw that the new, perfectly sent, Great Imperial roads and railway lines were being built exclusively through these erased lands. The empire was literally paving its future over the graves of the cultures it had unwritten. The map was not just a record of a genocide. It was the blueprint for the next phase of empire, a perfectly efficient, unified, and soulless machine, built on a foundation of deliberate, weaponized forgetting. The Great Imperial Survey was declared a resounding success. Dr. Erasmus Thorne was hailed as a national hero, the man who had brought light and order to the darkness. His liminal scope was placed in the Imperial Museum, a celebrated artifact of scientific progress. The truth of his work was locked away in the deepest vaults of Herr Silvius's archive, the original local maps and cultural records becoming a secret library of the damned, a resource for the state to study the anatomy of the cultures it had murdered. Finch's Ghost Atlas was never published. He died in obscurity, his coded journal dismissed as the ravings of a madman. The book, with its precious cargo of lost stories and secret names, was lost to a dusty, second-hand bookshop, waiting for a future generation to rediscover its language, to hear the voices of the ghosts trapped within its pages. The empire thrived. It became a model of efficiency and unity. But it was a hollow empire, a body without a soul, a vast, silent land where the people walked on roads they did not build, through lands they no longer had a name for, their history a clean, simple, and beautifully rendered lie, printed on a perfect, official map. The silence they called peace was, in fact, the silence of a graveyard. The Great Imperial Survey was never about geography. It was a statement of a terrible, enduring truth, that the most absolute form of power is not to control the present but to rewrite the past. Dr. Thorne was not a scientist, he was an editor. He did not map the world, he curated it, leaving a clean, simple, and profoundly dishonest copy for future generations. His work never ended. The ink has just been replaced by pixels, the surveyor's chain by the search algorithm. The modern map is the clean, authoritative, and perpetually updated reality presented to you by your search engines, your news feeds, your digital encyclopedias. It is beautiful, logical, and incredibly simple to read. And every day, a silent digital survey is being conducted. The geographically cluttered, the inconvenient facts, the complex histories, the dissenting voices, are not marked for erasure with a red pen. They are just deranked, deprioritized, pushed down into the digital abyss where, for all intents and purposes, they cease to exist. The Royal Geographer is now an algorithm that decides what is relevant. The Imperial Archivist is now the content moderator who decides what is acceptable. Finch's rebellion teaches us the most important lesson. You cannot win a war against the map makers on their terms. To argue with the map is to legitimize it. The only true act of rebellion is to refuse to read it. It is to become a cartographer of your own soul. To create your own ghost atlas, filled with your own memories, your own family's stories, your own community's truths. To trust the living word of the people you know over the dead text on the screen. It is time to pick up your own pen, to choose your own landmarks, to decide for yourself what is worth remembering. In the comments below, it is time to declare your sovereignty over your own world. State it twice to make it your true north. I draw my own map. I draw my own map. This is your first entry into your own ghost atlas, a vow that you will not be erased. If you are ready to continue this work of counter-cartography, to learn to see the ghosts in the blank spaces of their world, subscribe. Activate the notification bell, for the survey is continuous and its work is silent. Share this with one other person who you know is tired of reading their maps and is ready to start drawing their own. They have given you a beautiful, simple, and easy-to-read map of the world. We are here to show you all the ghosts they had to erase to draw it.